Hey Weirdos! I have been feeling awful the last few days and have fallen behind in creating new content, so this is a Darchive episode with stories that I shared originally back in May of 2018. So the audio quality will sound a bit different from what you're used to, but I hope you enjoy the episode anyway. Thanks. Ads heard during the podcast that are not in my voice are placed by third-party agencies outside of my control and should not imply an endorsement by Weird Darkness or myself.
Stories and content in Weird Darkness can be disturbing for some listeners and is intended for mature audiences only. Parental discretion is strongly advised.
On January 25, 1949, a tragic disappearance occurred in the city of Philadelphia. Many people have an interest in unsolved disappearances, but the case of Dorothy Forstein is among the saddest of these stories and is also one of the most unusual in the annals of American crime. To this day, her disappearance has never been solved, and strangely, the case was dropped from newspapers within a week after she vanished. Numerous attempts have been made to remove this case from the history books in recent years, but weird, tantalizing details still remain. I'm Darren Marlar, and this is Weird Darkness.
Welcome, Weirdos! I'm Darren Marlar, and this is Weird Darkness. Here you'll find stories of the paranormal, supernatural, legends, lore, the strange and bizarre, crime, conspiracy, mysterious, macabre, unsolved, and unexplained. Coming up in this episode, a college professor finds a footprint outside of his office, and the closer he examines it, the stranger it becomes. She wanders the road at night, haunting all those who pass. She is the bloody bride of 13 Curves Road. What's more terrifying than losing your very young child in the woods when your search for him turns into a paranormal encounter? That story and more. But first, Dorothy Forstein vanished from her Philadelphia home in 1949. To this day, her disappearance has never been solved. We begin there. If you're new here, welcome to the show. While you're listening, be sure to check out WeirdDarkness.com for merchandise, my newsletter, to enter contests, to connect with me on social media. Plus, you can visit the Hope in the Darkness page if you're struggling with depression or dark thoughts. You can find all of that and more at WeirdDarkness.com. Now, bolt your doors, lock your windows, turn off your lights, and come with me into the Weird Darkness.
Dorothy Forstein vanished from her Philadelphia home in 1949, having been married 9 years to her childhood sweetheart, Jules Forstein, who was a clerk for the Philadelphia City Council at the time of the wedding. Dorothy was a happy, outgoing young woman, and she became the devoted mother of 2 children, Marcy, an infant, and Myrna, age 10, who were children from Jules' first marriage. His wife had died in childbirth not long before he and Dorothy had become reacquainted. Their marriage was a happy one, and Forstein's professional life began to prosper when he was made a magistrate in 1943. Another child, Edward, was born a short time later. The Forsteins' idyllic life was shattered on January 25, 1945. Dorothy left the children with neighbors and went out to do some shopping. She reportedly joked with the butcher and chatted with friends as she went about her errands. Later, her neighbor saw her return home and thought that someone was with her or walking behind her as she made her way through the late evening shadows to her front door. It was getting dark, and the neighbor, Maria Townley, admitted that she didn't look closely at the man who was behind her. It was a safe neighborhood, and she never imagined that Dorothy was in trouble. Just as Dorothy was entering her 3-story brick home, the stranger, or whomever it might have been that Mrs. Townley saw, jumped out of the darkness at her. He began beating her with his fists and some sort of blunt instrument. Dorothy fell to the ground and was pounded into unconsciousness. As she tumbled into the house, her arm dislodged the hall telephone. In those days of live operators, the voice on the other end of the line heard the commotion and quickly summoned the police. The attacker fled at the sound of approaching sirens. Police officers arrived moments later and found a battered Dorothy on the floor of the hallway. She had suffered a broken jaw, a shattered nose, a fractured shoulder, and a brain concussion. She was rushed to the hospital, and when she awakened, she could only weakly explain that "Someone jumped out at me, I couldn't see who it was, he just hit me and hit me." Investigators labeled the attack an attempted murder, and Captain James A. Kelly of the Philadelphia Homicide Division began trying to put the pieces together. He concluded that it could only have been someone trying to kill Dorothy since no money, jewelry, or anything else had been taken from the Forstein home. Jules Forstein himself was investigated, but he had an unimpeachable alibi, and the children were too young to have been involved. The case was complicated by the fact that Dorothy had no known enemies and, in fact, was one of the most well-liked residents in the neighborhood. The most prevalent theory for the police investigators was that the attacker might have been someone who had appeared in court before Forstein and had assaulted Dorothy for revenge. Every possible lead was investigated, but no arrests were ever made. Dorothy recovered from her injuries but was so shaken by the incident that she was never the same again. Her happy and carefree personality was gone, replaced by an anxious woman who was nervous and upset, jumping at every noise in the house and checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows. She was sure that someone was out to get her, but who? Jules Forstein was perplexed. He was sure that no one with whom he had come into contact as a magistrate would bear him enough of a grudge to hurt his wife or his family, and yet he could not explain Dorothy's attack. He seldom left his wife and children alone, but on the night of October 18, 1949, he made plans to attend a political banquet. As he was leaving the office, he called his wife to check on her, explaining that he didn't plan to be home too late. Dorothy replied that everything was fine at home, and she joked with him for a moment, finally seeming more like her old self. "Be sure to miss me," she reportedly said just as she was hanging up. Tragically, her words would turn out to be prophetic ones. Around 11:30 p.m., Forstein came home to be greeted by the wails of his two youngest children, Edward and Marcy. They were huddled on the floor, crying and shrieking. Their sister, Myrna, was staying at a friend's house, and Dorothy was nowhere to be found. Forstein quickly discovered that the children were crying because their mother was gone. While surprised that she would have left the children at home by themselves, Forstein assumed that Dorothy was visiting with friends or neighbors. He telephoned for several hours, and no one had seen her. Finally, he called Captain Kelly again, and the detective soon started his men checking hospitals, morgues, and hotels all over Philadelphia. They worked frantically, but no clues were discovered. Kelly went door to door in the neighborhood, but no one had seen anything unusual. Wherever she was, Dorothy had left her purse, money, and keys at home. The front door to the house had been locked. The only lead came from 9-year-old Marcy Forstein, but her story was so wild that detectives at first dismissed it as nothing more than a child's frightened and overactive imagination. She told Captain Kelly that she had been awakened and had left her room to see a man coming up the stairs. He went into her mother's room, the door was cracked open, and Marcy stated that she could see Dorothy lying face down on the rug. She looked sick, the little girl offered. Then the man, whom she described as wearing a brown hat and brown jacket with something sticking out of his pocket, picked up her mother and put her over his shoulder. Dorothy was wearing red silk pajamas and red slippers at the time. Marcy asked the man what he was doing. He patted her on the head and replied, "Go back to sleep, little one. Your mommy has been sick, but she will be all right now." the man carried Dorothy downstairs and out the front door. He locked the door behind him and vanished. Marcy awakened her brother and they waited together for their father, who arrived home about 15 minutes later. The little girl told the detectives that she had never seen the man before and had no idea who he was. As bizarre as the story sounded, it was the only possible explanation the police had for Dorothy's disappearance. Nothing was disturbed in the house. There was no sign of a struggle, and also no indication that anyone else had been there. There was not a single fingerprint in the house that did not belong, and the investigators wondered how a man could have walked down the street with a woman in pajamas over his shoulder without someone noticing. And how had he gotten into the locked house anyway? It seemed impossible that the girl's story could be true, and yet it had to be. If no one had spirited the young woman away, then where had she gone? If she had walked away on her own, why had she not taken her purse or keys with her? Dorothy Forstein was never seen again. There were no leads, no suspects, and no explanations as to who might have taken her or why. Newspapers all over the country, especially in Pennsylvania, carried stories about her disappearance and possible kidnapping, and then by the end of October the story largely disappeared, just as Dorothy had done. She simply vanished, gone without a trace. For decades, no further word of Dorothy Forstein appeared in print. Then, in 2003, I featured the story of Dorothy Forstein on my website, and soon after, I received a letter from an attorney from the Forstein family asking if the story could be removed. The letter was not threatening. It merely made an appeal for the privacy of the family members and asked if I would consider removing it from the Internet out of consideration for their grief. I agreed to do so, and I later learned that several sites that had also featured my article on the disappearance had received a similar letter. Why the secrecy about a 50-year-old disappearance? No one could say, and to this day no one is talking. I've never heard anything else about this mysterious case, and there has been no further contact with anyone about it. After all of those years, the 2003 attention to the case of the missing housewife is almost as mysterious as the original vanishing, and neither is likely to ever be solved. I currently teach at a university in Nagoya, Japan. I have an office on the 6th floor which is comfortable and useful for meeting students and colleagues. I use it when doing research, class planning, and writing. I feel at home there with all of my books stacked on the shelves and my favorite photos on the wall. It has an atmosphere of being my sacred space, which I appreciate very much. Seminar rooms and the offices of other professors take up the rest of the 6th floor. I was in residence at this university for 2 years with nothing unusual happening to me, although one teacher from Jamaica, whose office was down the hall, reported that she had been obliged to chase some kind of strange spirit out of her office. Sometime during my 3rd year at the university, one of the professors from America knocked on my door and called me out into the hall. "Have you seen this?" he asked. He pointed to the floor, and there, placed squarely on a floor tile in front of my office door, was a human footprint. It was someone's right bare foot, situated so that it looked like it had just walked out of the door of my office. We looked at it with the astonishment it deserved. It had certainly not been there previously. Where had it come from? As we examined it more closely, we became even more baffled by this strange phenomenon. The first question that came to mind was who had been walking barefoot from my office that I was unaware of, and why barefoot? When we looked closer, the mystery only deepened. It was not just a print, but it was bulging up out of the solid floor tile, as if someone had stepped on the underside of it and made a deep impression pointing upward. The hallway flooring consisted of solid linoleum floor tiles placed on top of a metal floor. How was it possible for an impression of a barefoot to be pushing up out of a solid floor tile? The person who made it would have had to have been walking shoeless on the ceiling of the 5th floor, leaving an impression that pushed up all the way through solid steel and linoleum. Try as we might, we could think of no logical explanation for what we were looking at. I soon learned to just accept the footprint as part of my office landscape and went about my business. Soon, however, I began to hear an occasional loud rap coming from the front of my office, as if someone were knocking with a fist hard upon the wall. Several times I got up and went to my door, but there was never anyone there. It was the same every time, one loud knock on the wall and then silence. Soon I was hearing the rap almost every day, sometimes several times a day. I had experienced such things many times before, however, so I just accepted it and went on with my teaching. About 2 years later, I was walking down the hallway to my office when I happened to glance down at the floor and was stopped in my tracks by what I saw. There, next to the ghostly footprint that had been sitting outside my office, was a second footprint that had appeared beside it. It was almost identical to the first one, someone's shoeless right foot, placed as if it was striding out my office door. My fellow teachers and I examined it as closely as we could. Once again, we could find no logical explanation as to how it had gotten there. "This could only happen to you," the Jamaican lady said to me as she shook her head in wonder. Many of the other teachers knew about my many encounters with strange phenomena and my interest in the supernatural. After a few weeks, a third footprint began to appear, but thus far it's only showing the front toes of the foot. Many of my friends found time to stop by and shake their heads at the footprints, but none could offer any explanation as to what had made them or where they'd come from. The rapping on my front wall became a daily occurrence, and life went on. In one final weird chapter to this story, I decided I would like a photo of the footprints as proof of what I was talking about when I told the story of the footprints to other people. I have been unable to get a clear photo, however, as the lighting in the hallway is very bad and a flash photograph simply blurred out the prints, making it difficult to see them. I asked a friend who is a professional photographer to help me out. He came to my office, set up special lighting, used several different lenses and exposure settings, but he was unable to get anything but a flat, barely discernible image. Finally, we gave up on the project, went out and had a drink. Had a great conversation about the supernatural and the many mysteries in the world. 2 weeks later, I was working late in my office. After I finished up, I grabbed my coat, shut off the lights in my room, and opened the door. I stopped and stared in wonder at the sight that greeted me just outside my office door. There, at my feet, all 3, or should I say all 2.5 footprints, were glowing brightly in a soft golden light. The hallway outside my office is long and badly lit with dim fluorescent lighting. At the far end of the hallway, about 30 feet away, is a very small window, about 2 feet tall, half a foot in width. In what was perhaps a very rare event, the glowing sundown taking place on the far horizon was hitting the window squarely, sending a long beam of golden light down the hallway that fell directly on the spot where the footprints lay, bathing them in a soft golden light that revealed every detail. Knowing the situation would not last very long, I took out my cell phone and used its tiny camera to get the picture that I had been trying so hard to take before. If you ask me, I'll be glad to show it to you. Or you can visit my office and see the footprints for yourself. If you can come up with a logical explanation of where they came from or what's rapping on my office wall, I would be glad to hear it. After a long night, the dark drive home along a back county road can be perilous. Your eyes play tricks on you. But those who've traveled down Cedarvale Road just outside of Syracuse, New York, know they can't all be seeing the same trick. Can they? For decades, nighttime travelers of Cedarvale Road, perhaps better known as 13 Curves Road, have claimed to see the chilling sight of a young woman, battered and bloody, still dressed in her white wedding gown, wandering along the side of the road. This apparition is known as the Bloody Bride, and it's said that she and her husband died on the very night of their marriage after losing control of their vehicle along the winding stretch. Others say the young bride survived only to come back in death to haunt the spot where she lost her new husband so many years before. Dozens of witnesses have claimed to see the Bloody Bride gliding along the road. Sometimes she's described as carrying a small lantern. For some, especially unlucky drivers, the Bloody Bride appears in the back seat of their own car with a haunting expression on her face before disappearing. As long as most can remember, the tragic tale of the Bloody Bride of 13 Curves Road has been told. Some locals believe the accident took place over 100 years ago, and instead of a car, the bride and her husband were thrown from a horse and buggy down the steep curve and into the creek. A local named David D'Ambrosio has been known to string up a spooky decoration resembling the Bloody Bride in the trees that line the road. The decoration gives motorists quite the shock on the pitch-black stretch where even the stars are covered by a dense canopy of trees. One eyewitness claimed as he and his friend made their way around the sixth curve, a dim, glowing white shape appeared in the road ahead of us. It slowly made its way from the left side of the road to the right. When it got in the middle of the road, it stopped and turned towards us. It was about the height of an average woman, but it was not very well defined. It was more of a staticky blur than a clear image. It did have a red glow up near where their head would approximately be on a human being. There is a helpful map for those brave enough to venture along the snaking curves, but beware. The Bloody Bride is known to lunge out, desperate to catch passing vehicles. Whatever you do, do not explore the darkness on foot. The winding road is dangerous and dark. It was the summer of 1984, and we decided to take the newly acquired, used Nimrod camper out. If you're unfamiliar, it's pretty much a pop-up tent that folds flat into a wee trailer so that you can tow it behind your car. Our destination was at the southern tip of Illinois, the Shawnee National Forest, to be more exact, the area called the Garden of the Gods in Herod. It's a spectacular place and very rustic, as in there are no hookups for water or power. They did have restrooms, of sorts, scattered about the various camping locations. A low cement building whose interior reminded me of an outhouse. I learned later these were called vault toilets. I've heard that in some areas they have cabins you can rent, but the forest is so huge we neither saw them or even saw evidence of other people when we pulled into the area that we'd been assigned to, almost at the rim of a very deep valley. My son Josh was only 2.5 years old at the time and insisted he wanted to help Daddy set up the camper while I gathered firewood and set up the rest of our site. I wasn't gone long. Firewood in a forest is pretty easy to find. My husband was still setting up the camper. Well, fidgeting with getting the door in right. "Where's Josh?" I immediately asked, not seeing him in plain sight. My then-husband, half-turning, said, "He's right," and froze, looking at empty space. We both started calling his name and searching the area. He was gone, nowhere to be seen, and I strained my ears for any muffled cry or anything. I studied the ground for hints of his trail, clues to which direction he may have wandered off in. My now ex thought I was crazy, kneeling down in the spot he'd last seen my boy and slowly turning in a circle. But I was making myself Josh-sized and trying to see things as he had. Straining my eyes for bent grass, a partial print, anything to say "this way." Inwardly, I was both praying and summoning up every scrap of knowledge I had ever learned about tracking, while in my head I heard the words of the old man at the registration cabin saying, "Watch out for bears and coyotes. There's some snakes, too," on repeat. Josh was only a baby. He'd think they'd behave like his cartoon characters and be friendly. I felt his dad's hand on my shoulder, and I hissed, "You go back to the registration area. You go back and tell them our boy's lost. They'll get us help. I'll keep looking." He opened his mouth to protest, I think, then turned to get in the pickup truck. He knew, city boy that he was, this was more my world than his, and I stood a better chance. Still kneeling, I forced myself to breathe deep, to find that inner core of strength and open myself. I found myself getting up and wandering to the opposite side of the camper and staring down into the valley, where large boulders jutted up out of the ground and trunks of trees towered up. Some mere saplings, others the size of a dining room table in diameter. Below me, eagles circled and soared. The glory of this beauty nearly lost to me as I scanned for a small figure. From my peripheral vision, on my left, I saw something move on the ridge. I spun in that direction and saw nothing for a moment. I dropped to my knee. There, in the distance, in the shadows of the trees, a dark, child-sized shadow ran. "Josh!" I called. It paused, looking at me, I think, then ran behind a larger tree, lost from view. I was up in a flash, running towards where I'd seen him. Logically, at some depth of my mind, I knew, though toddlers can move like greased lightning, this was not my boy I was chasing down. This dark shadow was always ahead of me, just far enough I'd see him, but no details, but it obviously wanted to be seen and followed. I heard a man's voice. "Leave a trail. Won't do any good to get lost yourself." I responded by purposely breaking twigs and snapping long-stemmed flowers as I passed. A blind tracker could have followed me. I talked to the air, "Help me find my boy!" Tears were threatening to flow, but now was not the time. Again, just ahead and to the right, I saw the shadow boy, and again I was running. The voice would yell, "Trail marker!" and I'd snap something on the fly. I was not quietly stalking. Heck, I was no longer even tracking. I forced myself to stop panic searching. I forced myself to stop, right where I was, and become still. Not just outer still, but inwardly. Panicking like this was not the answer. Blindly chasing shadows was not the answer. This was not the way to find my boy. I closed my eyes and focused. Imagery slowly emerged from behind my closed eyes. I saw a kind of tunnel with my child inside. I frowned. That made no sense. Something whacked me in the shoulder. Not hard, but enough to make me jerk my head, with my eyes flying open in that direction. Perhaps 2 yards away, closer than ever before, was that dark child. A bit more than shadow, but still very vague, as in I couldn't make out details such as clothing or facial features. Older than 2, but still quite young. This time, instead of darting off, he waved me to come. I snapped another twig and followed because I felt I should. He stayed just a bit ahead, and from time to time his form would twist as if looking back to be sure I was following. I lost him somewhere, or perhaps he just vanished. I sat down on a large fallen log and looked back the way I'd come. "Oh, baby, where are you?" My voice a coarse whisper from all the calling I'd been doing. To the forest spirits I cried, "What the hell was the point of this? I don't understand!" My voice broke, and lowering my head I began to cry, out of fear for my boy and frustration. I felt a small hand on my thigh and heard, "Why cry?" Turning my head, I saw my son miraculously standing there. I snatched him into my arms before he could evaporate, for I was sorely afraid he was just a trick of my mind. But he was real. He was my boy. How I laughed to hear him say, "You're squishing me!" "Where you been, Pumpkin? I've looked everywhere for you." "There." He pointed at the log. I was baffled. "I didn't see you." He giggled. "Inside. My friend woke me up. He says you here." "Inside where? Can you show me?" He gives me that look that only small children give well. It asks if you're an idiot because to them it's so obvious. Taking me by the hand, he led me to the end of the log I'd been sitting on and pointed. Squatting down, I see its hollow inside, and I recall my vision of a tunnel. "I playing with my friend and got tired. He said safe there." I nod. Yes, safer there than in the open. In my head I added where bears or coyotes could get you easier. Out loud I say, "We should get back to Daddy. He's looking for you too. Why'd you go off like that?" We followed my blind man's trail back with my son, telling me his adventure. From what I gathered, he'd gotten bored helping Daddy because he wasn't allowed to do anything, and he got tired of digging in the dirt, so he started looking around. When he was on the other side of the camper, looking down at the birds and stuff, this boy came up and told him it wasn't safe to play there and led him over to the trees. He said the boy's name was Chaska. After a while, Josh became very tired and he and his friend curled up in the log for a nap. Then I was there. Of course, no one else believed his story. They thought it was all imagination, with the exception of the old man for the reception area. He looked at me, the sage way some old country folks have, and said, "Chaska, Sioux for firstborn son." Of course, I never told them my side of the story. Let them think I'm a star tracker. The overcast sky lowers a light fog over the small mountain town, leaving enough water on Morris's window to require wipers, but not enough for even the lowest position without the obnoxious sound they make when the glass is too dry. A flash from the intersection camera ahead signals someone breaking a traffic law. Morris patiently waits a quarter-mile back from said intersection and remembers a friend laughing about a traffic camera taking his picture while jaywalking. This pedestrian story lends an answer to the question forming but unspoken, why are the traffic cams flashing if cars aren't moving? With windows tightly closed and music playing softly, Morris looks down at his phone to select a song that will continue the overcast mood that the previous song had established. He stops at a good one and waits for the cars ahead to move. Another flash from the camera. Morris huffs out a laugh and shakes his head at a second person caught. Through the smear of water on his windshield, he sees his light change to green. Despite someone's reminder honk, traffic remains unmoving. Unsuccessfully, Morris adjusts his seat in vain hopes of progression. The pattering of rainfall morphs into heavy rumbling and the smearing increases, but only enough to limit his visibility to 10 or 15 car lengths. To the right, he sees someone's making their way on foot against the flow of traffic in the neighboring lane. The pedestrian, no doubt soaked by now, stops and leans down to the driver's side window of a red hatchback 2 cars ahead and to the right. The driver and the gentleman walking down the roadway apparently began arguing, by the looks of the upset and aggressive attempts at communication. He even hit the window in an attempt to grab the driver. Morris checks his dashboard clock and another flash catches his attention. It's the dreaded intersection camera again, the all-seeing equalizer of travelers. Morris releases a frustrated sigh and wonders how likely it is that so many people would be jaywalking. How many flashes was it now? 5? 6? He wonders, could it really be 6? No, he thinks, and tries to recount the flashes he's seen. Somewhere beyond his sight, he hears an angry shout. Another flash from the camera brings him back to reality. his Silverado unmoving despite the continued light changes. The vehicles ahead have their brake lights illuminated awaiting their turn. Another flash from the traffic cam. The intersection between the driver of the red hatchback and the offending pedestrian has boiled into scratching at the window as the driver kicks open his door and gets out to confront the man at his car's window. With so many people setting off the camera and traffic standing still, there must be an accident, Morse decides. That's the only scenario his mind lets him accept, despite the foreboding feeling of something worse occurring. A nervous chill shakes Morris, and he reaches for his temperature control to turn up the heater. As he does this, someone else walking through traffic hits his side view mirror with their shoulder. The strike is hard enough to shove the mirror against the passenger side window and spin the person away from the window, but neither the impact nor the ensuing bang cause the person to apologize or to stop and fix it. Morris watches them limp awkwardly away. This is not how Morris prefers to spend his day off. Irritation grows in pressure and begins to take the place of his typical levity. Morris clears his throat as another flash illuminates the falling rain, and he unbuckles, scoots across the seat, and lowers the window to fix his mirror. Through the open window in heavy rain, he can see more pedestrians leaning in towards other cars. One seems to notice him but stays at the window in which he is currently engaging. Morris incorrectly assumes that they are communicating the details of the incident, so he waits and briefly considers calling to them for answers. The signal changes, but traffic doesn't. Morris hears the sound of an engine roaring and the intersection flashes, this time his lane moving forward a car length. That has to be at least 6 flashes now, right? 6 seems like so many. Accidents aren't unusual, but his light, now changing again from yellow to red, is only stalling progress, and uncharacteristically, he honks his horn. He can hear shouts now over his music. The voices must be close, given that he can hear them through the weather. He's growing frustrated now and closes his window after pushing his passenger side mirror back into position. His honk has inspired a constant spattering of honks, and he can see that his light is once again green. As has become typical for the moment, the green light is meaningless if the cars ahead don't move. More flashes light up the thickening fog, and Morris begins to wonder how severe things ahead must be for that many people to set off the cameras. He thinks he hears screaming now, but can't really see or hear anything specific. From his left lane position, he notices traffic on his side beginning to move, finally, while the camera lights continue to strobe, diligently capturing each wrongdoing. Ahead and to the right, car tires screech as an impatient driver, tired of waiting, takes their chance at freedom. Other vehicles follow suit, and the right lane begins to pass the other cars with an unnerving quickness. The traffic cam begins another ongoing series of photo flashes, capturing each car, and suddenly his lane begins to move as well. As he approaches the intersection, his own mind, much like the stationary traffic cams, takes only photographs of what's holding up traffic. What he sees is an airport shuttle, smashed hood first into a traffic light pole, immediately to the right across from the turn lane he's aiming for. In the intersection, he sees a large group of the shuttle's previous occupants, seeming to fight for position, kneeling intensely over a person on their back, arms spread wide to each side, as if stopped halfway through pretending to make a snow angel by the ravenous mob consuming the once-living passenger. From that huddle, 4 people are walking away off-kilter, clothes blood and gore-soaked, faces slack-jawed and fed towards oncoming traffic. In the periphery, people stare on with shocked and horrified faces. Windows are securely closed with phones capturing everything. More people limp and wander through the traffic, their clothes covered in red, which only adds to the horror. Some pedestrians try desperately to get into their cars in the intersection, and as he races away above the roar of his engine, he hears screaming. It's definitely screaming. Over the following days, months, and years, after everything changes and it becomes clear that nothing will ever be the same, he wonders what those traffic cams caught, and if the flashes of pictures can clear up how it all started, the beginning of the end.
Weird Darkness continues in just a moment. Do you keep a journal or diary? If not, maybe you should consider it. It's been shown that journaling can help you reduce stress, help relieve depression, builds self-confidence, it boosts your emotional intelligence, helps with achieving goals, inspires creativity, and more. In fact, my friend S. Ann Lanise has created a Weird Darkness-themed journal just for you, full of blank pages for you to use as a diary, make notes for class or office meetings, jot down ideas for that novel you want to write, use it for keeping a mileage log if you travel for business, whatever you want. In fact, she has numerous styles of journals to choose from. Along with the Weird Darkness journal, there's one for dealing with grief, for teacher's notes, for medical residencies, keeping track of your meds or health routine, and several others. Journals make a great gift for others, but it's also a great gift for yourself and your own mental health. No matter what you might want to journal for, my friend Anne has it, and you can see all of her journals, including the one for Weird Darkness, on the Sponsors and Friends page at WeirdDarkness.com.
I have always been a little open to or aware of the paranormal since I was very small. My first encounter was when I was 15 years old. I was born and raised in Texas, and we used to spend our summer and Christmas holiday breaks at my grandparents' house up north. Their house was built in the beginning of the 1900s, so when I was a child it was already about 100 or more years old. The floors are extremely creaky, and you could hear any footsteps loudly and clearly. One summer, my older brother decided to stay in our apartment in Houston and not go with us to my grandparents' house, which also meant that I had to sleep alone in the guest bedroom with my mother and her husband in the room next to mine. I didn't sleep at all that night. I went to bed around midnight, but I couldn't fall asleep. While I was at least trying to fall asleep around 4 a.m., I heard someone walking outside my bedroom door. This someone was walking slowly back and forth, and I heard it stop outside my bedroom door for a couple of seconds, followed by more walking back and forth a few times. I never wanted to stay at that house again. Years later, I asked my grandfather if he had ever heard it. He told me he had heard it, seen it, spoken to it, shot at it, and accepted it as a house guest he neither wanted nor cared for. I guess that's a Texan's way of dealing with the paranormal. Several years ago, I moved into a 4-bedroom house that my brother had just vacated. After a few weeks, strange things started to happen. At first, I thought I could always see a little girl's shadow following my oldest son, who was 11. My second youngest son, who was 8 at the time, slept in a room alone. There was always a strange presence in the room when we walked into it. She also owned a doll, and every time at around 2 p.m., it started talking on its own, even when it was turned off. Many times when I left my bedroom door, I could hear people talking, and I would see strange lights on my door. They seemed to be the kind of lights you would get if the TV was on in a dark room. One night my daughter was taking a nap at around 8 p.m. She suddenly woke up to see our dog barking at a corner. When she looked into the corner, she saw a man staring at her. One night, my youngest son crawled out of his cot and walked into the living room and just stared outside. I picked him up and put him back to bed. After a while, lights started flickering on and off, so we just moved. I live in an apartment in New Jersey with my mother, her grandparents, my twin sister, and my younger brother. I've always believed in the paranormal, and I've read several books on the matter. My own story happened when I was 14 years old and I was home alone in our apartment. I was lying on a couch in the TV room when, from the kitchen, I heard a laugh. I didn't know if it was from a woman or a man, but I soon heard footsteps coming from the kitchen, walking toward the living room. I sat up on the couch and waited for something to emerge, but nothing did. It was completely silent in the apartment. So I looked back at the TV, and then I heard a growl as if someone was sitting on the couch behind me, but I didn't dare look. Then, loud and clear, I heard the growl right in my ear. I heard that demons feed off of people's fear, so I tried not to show fear and ignored it. I immediately texted my twin to come upstairs, and when she did, I told her what had happened to me. She then went back downstairs, and I stayed alone again. But nothing more happened. I've always felt watched in this apartment since. It was the early 90s, and my husband went to work out of town for about a month or so. I had put my 2 daughters to bed, and I was getting ready to go to sleep myself. From the room that I was sleeping in, you could see straight into our living room. In one of the corners, I used to see this shadow person that would always try to get my attention. I had seen it that night waving its shadow arms from side to side as if it was trying to get my attention. I was so used to seeing it that I just ignored it. It really didn't seem to mean me or my family any harm. My daughters were already sound asleep, and I was getting ready to get into my bed in the room next to theirs when our dog came and laid down first at the foot of my bed. I flipped the TV on and turned the volume down and was getting very sleepy very quickly. I could still see the shadow trying to get my attention when all of a sudden I saw it stop waving its arms, and I got this feeling of fear and dread. My dog started barking and focusing on the ceiling in the living room, but he would not leave the bed. I lay there as still as possible and with my limited night vision could see this black thing crawling really quite quickly on the ceiling. The other shadow was still there doing its thing. All of a sudden I saw it poke its head out and it looked straight at me. All I could see was this thick, black fog, but you could tell it had control of it. Anyways, it was running around the ceiling for over 10 minutes, the longest 10 minutes of my life. My dog would not take his eyes off this thing. Once the feeling of dread left the room, I knew it was gone. The other shadow started again with the waving. I still have no idea what the connection was between these 2 creepy nighttime visitors. A few years ago, I retired and I wanted to move to a mobile home. After years of working in the city, I really did want to just move to the country and live a peaceful life. We decided to make the move and took ownership of a mobile home in Utah. The mobile home itself dates from the 1960s and has been well kept. I saw no problems buying it, and it has been a sound investment. Except that it's haunted. Since we moved in, we have seen strange shadows, We've had strange voices calling out in the home. We've had the oven turning itself on. We've had the trailer rocking from side to side. I've also been unable to get a constant signal on my cell phone, and we only get an intermittent TV signal. My wife decided to go stay with her sister, so I'm here alone. I find that if I talk to the spirit, it responds in its own way. A few nights ago, I was asleep on the built-in bed and felt something grab my shirt at the neck. I wriggled and it let go. It seems that whatever is in here is trying to get my attention. I had wondered up to that point if it was something to do with electrical interference, but I don't think so. I think this mobile home is haunted. While serving in the Army, stationed at Fort Hood, I had a huge life-changing experience. I had just arrived from Germany, and some guys I spent time with at home wanted to show me around. They talked about a place where strange things happened. We went one night to a place out in the country between a cove off of Highway 190, which they said was a strange place to spend time. Apparently, the story behind the place was that loads of children were traveling on a bus. The bus ran off a large bridge on the road and the bodies were never recovered. We parked a few hundred feet from this bridge on this single-lane road, and they poured baby powder on the back of the car. We walked halfway across this timber bridge and stopped. Everything was quiet for a few minutes. Then I heard children's voices faintly that seemed to be coming from the dry riverbed. Then I could hear cries and we all got a little freaked out and decided to go. I was terrified. We then went back to the car and found ghostly footprints and handprints all in the baby powder. I don't need to tell you that I never returned there. On the 13th October 2014, I was on holiday in Chicago to meet my old friend Ron. I stayed with him for some days, and then we went to meet another old friend, Jake, in Viroqua, a small town nearby. Ron and I went to celebrate his 16th birthday and Halloween. We lived very well in Jake's house. It was big, and his room was full of gaming equipment. We nicely celebrated his birthday with a huge party given by him and his parents for his friends and family on the 24th of October. We traveled to lots of places near Viroqua up to the 30th October, but due to some business meeting, his parents had to go out on 30th October to Chicago for 7 days, so we couldn't celebrate Halloween so well. However, we decided to visit a cemetery for Halloween. After some time, we chose a cemetery called Walnut Mound near Viroqua that we saw it on our PC, and we decided to go on the night of the 31st October. That night, we reached Walnut Mound Cemetery in Retreat, Wisconsin at night, around 10 p.m. We all got out of the car and entered the cemetery and walked around to check for a tree which is situated in the center of the cemetery, which is said to be haunted, and that if you touch it, then the tree may shed all its leaves as it is possessed by a demon or evil spirit. We decided to give it a try, and to also search for Francis Asbury Waller's gravestone, who was a great Civil War soldier. All was fine until about 11 p.m., but after that we saw a bunch of fog starting to emerge, so we decided that it was time to find the tree. As we walked through the cemetery and reached the center of it, we suddenly heard the voice of a girl crying behind a tree in the center of the cemetery. As we got closer to it, the crying stopped, and although we searched all around the tree, there was no girl or anyone there. We thought that perhaps it was actually the sound of leaves being blown around due to the breeze. When we looked at the tree, the wind blew so hard that we all had to lie on the ground. Then the wind stopped suddenly, and we looked at each other in surprise as the tree had shed all of its leaves, like the myth suggested it would. Jake was so scared that he was breathing very hard, and he said he was going back to the car and would carry on with us later. I continued to search, still in surprise about the tree, and then we went to find the Waller gravestone heading in a northerly direction. I saw one gravestone with two tiny gravestones in similar design by its side that took my interest, and so I went over to it. I started to look at them when I heard the sound of walking behind me, and in fear I looked behind me, and there was a woman in 18th century clothing standing there looking at me. In surprise, I fell over a gravestone and hurt my back. Where the woman was standing, I saw that there were also two men in coats looking at me as if they were going to kill me. They were around 30 meters away, and I started to run. As I started running, they appeared again in front of me, blocking my path, and I was so scared that I started to tremble and shake. I started running again without looking back and ran out of the cemetery and to the car in fear. I didn't find Jake inside the car, though, so I started to look for him and called his name, but there was no sign of him. As it turns out, both Ron and Jake were in trouble, just like me. When Jake was heading to the car, he fell into some bushes. There, out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a yellow light, like a glowing bulb 50 meters away from him, and he started to follow it out of curiosity. He soon lost sight of it, however, but instead he saw a bald old man standing with a lamp in his hand looking right at him. He was so scared and began to run to try to find his way out of the cemetery. He met Ron on the way out. Well, we all jumped in the car and we drove away as fast as possible from the cemetery to his home. We reached Viroqua around 1 a.m. and were tired and so slept at once and couldn't speak to each other. The next day we all shared our stories, and when Ron shared his, we all felt strange and full of fear. He said when he found the Waller's grave and that there was another gravestone nearby from which smoke emerged and he got scared. Then he felt a spirit enter his body and he fell on the ground, breathing hard as if somebody was holding his neck tightly with both the hands. He managed to stand, and the spirit came out of his body, but he felt sick and feverish and ran away fast, meeting Jake on the way out. So there, how was our experience in this haunted cemetery that we thought to be safe? But no, it was the worst experience in our lives, and we would never be going back there again. Never. After hearing that there was an old warehouse outside of town, 6 of my friends and I decided to go out there and see what we could find. We all had an interest in the paranormal, and this was a good opportunity to see something. We arrived at the site and went through the first 3 buildings, really just having a good time. We entered the 4th building, and the walls were covered in graffiti. Quite strange graffiti, really. After being in there for a while, pieces of concrete started to fall, or so we thought. We later realized that it was rocks that were hitting the wall before the ground, which led us to the conclusion that they were being thrown. It was at this point that we got brave and decided to turn all of the flashlights off at once and stand against the back wall. Every single time we turned the flashlights off, a rock was thrown. We decided to leave the lights off for a longer time. This time we heard something walking across the other end of the room. We waited in silence and kept hearing footsteps. When my friend finally decided to turn the flashlight on and direct it to that area, nothing was there. We decided it was time to leave. On the walk back down the trail, limbs kept falling from nowhere. In other words, there was no tree above it. At one point, a rock landed by my foot. Rocks don't fall from trees. We haven't been back there since. But there's an interesting end note to this. Later that evening, my girlfriend told me privately that something had grabbed her foot and tried to yank her away from me. I have had something attached to me since I was in school. I have lived in California most of my life, but between the ages of 5 and 7, my family and I lived in Oklahoma. Every house we lived in that I can remember was haunted. When I was 12, we lived in a house with poltergeist activity. Things would fly across the room by themselves. Every night, my brother would see a shadow on his bedroom wall of a man who would always end up sitting next to him on his bed, breathing on him. Apparently the breathing was audible to him. Every night in my room, the closet door would open by itself, no matter what I put in front of it to keep it from happening. I even pushed my big dresser up against it, but it didn't matter. It still pushed it out of the way and opened the closet. I also had something that played with my hair every night. We were staying at a small hotel in the Lake District of England. My husband and I were asleep in the room, but something woke me up. I watched the shadow of a tall figure walk into the bathroom and then listened to someone pee in the toilet. I thought it was my husband at first, but then, when no one came out of the bathroom, I felt across the bed and found my husband still lying there asleep. Weird, huh? A peeing ghost in the bathroom? I have always been a little different, as some of my friends and family might say, but I have had some very interesting experiences. My first experience, that to this very day I still do not understand, happened when I was about 6 years old. My dad had just put me down to sleep in my bedroom when I started to hear a voice. The voice was always the same, calm and almost seemed friendly. It would ask me, "Jump up the wall with me," meaning up the wall in my bedroom. So I was basically jumping against the wall. I then would feel hands pulling me up and down, and I would laugh, and so would the voice. Soon the voice was asking me to do even more strange things. It would ask me to climb onto the banister and stand up and jump, and I will carry you down. This house was a 3-story house. The voice told me to do the same again, and I did, and I really do remember being carried safely to the floor. It seemed like I was floating. Again, it asked me to do it again one day, and I did, only the voice had changed in some way. But being young, what was I to know? I jumped and cracked my head straight open and damaged my spine. When I was a young boy, my aunt was still hanging on to her life. She had lived a tough life and suffered from several different types of cancer. I had met her once and had been quite alarmed. My parents had taken me to the nursing home that she lived at, and she had been covered with tumors and looked as though she was wasting away. My mother was desperate for her to see me, though, so we had a nice visit. A few days later, I was playing in my bedroom with a plastic phone. It was one of my favorite toys, and it started ringing as though it were real. I picked it up, placed it to my ear, and discovered that it was my Aunt Sheba. "Hello," she said. "It's your Auntie Sheba. Don't worry about anything. It's all going to be fine. Tell your parents not to worry." I said nothing. Later I mentioned that call to my parents, but they didn't believe me. My father said that the old girl was still alive and that I must have been imagining things. That evening, we received a call from her husband who told my parents that she had died. My parents were spooked, threw the plastic phone away, and I haven't heard from her since.
More Weird Darkness is still to come. Suicide or murder in the shadow of a nation's capital.
Alice, you were right. There was a body in the cellar last night.
You know that?
I'm positive of it. Only there were 2 bodies.
The screen's master of horror, Bela Lugosi, has the answer to this mysterious death.
This time, she sought refuge in a strong man's arms.
I just ran into yours.
Mine might be dangerous.
Lugosi, as a madman on a mission of vengeance. Is he friend or foe? You'll find the answer to this fantastic mystery in Black Dragons. Join us Friday, January 26th for our next Weirdo Watch Party as we watch Black Dragons, presented by Horror Hotel's resident vampire, Lamia, Queen of the Dark, bringing us trivia about the film, the actors, and all things horror-related in between segments of the show. And then stick around after Black Dragons because Doc Dredd will be with us with one of his popular and fun movie reviews, giving his opinion of 2023's award-winning horror flick, Beneath Us All. The Weirdo Watch Party's always free to watch online with everybody, so grab your popcorn, candy, and soda and jump into the fun and even get involved in the live chat as we watch the movie. It's Black Dragons, starring Bela Lugosi from 1942, presented by Horror Hotel's Lamia, Queen of the Dark, then Doc Dredd's movie review talking about Beneath Us All. Friday, January 26th, starting at 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Mountain, 7 p.m. Pacific. See a few clips from the film and invite your friends to watch along with you on the Weirdo Watch Party page at WeirdDarkness.com. And we'll see you Friday, January 26th for the Weirdo Watch Party.
In the early 80s, a close friend of my husband's came to visit us from California. He stayed for a couple of months and was helping my husband do some garden work. One day he stopped and went into the garage to pick out a tool for my husband. I was outside, sitting, watching the men work. My husband's friend called from the garage. "Who is the Glenn Miller fan?" he called out. My husband and myself turned to the garage and then looked at each other. "Neither of us," I called back. "Can you get some more iced tea?" We didn't get a reply. My husband went into the garage and saw his friend searching around for the source of this old, crackly big band music. Neither of them could find out where it was coming from. They moved some boxes and found an old radio at the back of the garage. Behind it was a box full of old toys and a sack filled with old camera equipment. The radio kept on playing. I joined them both in the garage, and that's when I noticed something. The radio was unplugged. Did we hear a ghost broadcast from the era of big band music? While my brother was staying with me, we both just slept in my bed in my room. After we had both gone to bed and I was in a deep sleep, I suddenly snapped awake and couldn't move. I felt like I had something akin to an elephant standing on top of my chest. I opened my eyes wide and saw this vague black figure lying on top of me, holding me onto the bed. It seemed weightless but felt heavier than anything I've ever known. I tried desperately to scream, and, to be honest, I'm not so sure a noise even managed to escape my mouth. The figure opened what seemed to be its mouth, showing these strange, razor-sharp teeth, It then screeched in my face and vanished. I could feel its breath on my face. I checked my brother to make sure he was okay, and he was still sound asleep. It's like there is nothing happening to anyone else in the world when these occurrences happen. No noises are ever heard by other people in your vicinity. It all seems to happen on a different plane of existence. I ended up falling back asleep and was later again woken up to the sound of my brother gasping and the sight of him struggling. I shook him until he was able to move again, and he started crying, telling me this thing was holding him down and trying to hurt him. He described exactly what I had seen in vivid detail. Of course, I saw nothing because it wasn't happening to me. I wonder how many people on a daily basis are tormented by these happenings without anyone ever believing them. I'm 30 years old now, but this experience happened to me when I was 21, just 2 days after my birthday, in fact. I was working for a fast food joint as a driver making deliveries. I went out on a delivery that day, and on my way back to the office, a bus skipped a traffic light and hit me and my motorcycle on the side. When I woke up, the back wheel of the bus was pressing against my side, and I was lying there under the bus in pain. All of my fingers on one hand were pointing in the wrong direction, and that freaked me out. Out of nowhere, this small girl was sitting with me underneath the bus and talking to me, just saying, "You will be fine." I told her to get out from underneath the bus, as that was no place for a child. When the ambulance arrived on the scene, they strapped me to a board and lifted me into the ambulance where an old man with a leather jacket was sitting. He asked me what had happened, and I told him the whole story. He also told me that I would be fine. When we arrived at the hospital, my aunt was waiting for me. I saw one of the paramedics speaking to her, and then they sent me right into the emergency room to check me for brain damage. I was in the hospital for a week and then went home with cracked ribs and broken fingers. Everybody told me that I was lucky to have survived the crash. When I asked my aunt what the paramedic had told her, she said that I had been talking to myself the whole way to the hospital in the ambulance, and so they thought that perhaps I had brain damage. I told her about the man with the leather jacket who was in the ambulance with me and described how he looked. A couple of days later, I saw a framed picture of that same man from the ambulance, and when I asked my aunt who he was, she told me it was my grandfather. He had died in a motorbike accident when my dad was about 10 years old. I just froze and told her that was the man I had been talking to in the ambulance. She just laughed and said that it could be that I had a guardian angel. This story took place when I was around 10 years old. My family lived in Phoenix, Arizona. I was the baby of the family, and my brothers and sisters were older and on their own. My home life was full of domestic abuse, and my home life was less than pleasant. Anyway, one summer afternoon I was outside playing baseball with some friends, and I decided to go inside to cool off and watch some TV because it was getting extremely hot outside. I lay down on my bed upstairs and began watching TV. The bedroom window was to the back of me, and I was facing the TV to the opposite side. I was watching TV when all of a sudden something made me look up to the right corner of my wall. As I did, I saw a large, beautiful white dove somehow melt through the wall and straight through to the left side of the wall. As it flew across the room, the wings flapped but never made a sound. The whole time my eyes never left the dove and everything just went silent. Whatever it was had my attention, and it was amazing to see. It was a moment in my life that I will never forget, and I still remember it like yesterday, even though I'm in my late 20s now. Sometimes the most beautiful things happen to us when we least expect it. One day, when my mother was quite young, perhaps in her early teens, she fell asleep during the afternoon watching TV in the living room. When she awoke, she noticed her aunt rising from the rocking chair in the living room to walk down the hallway to the kitchen. My mom just assumed that her aunt had come over while she was asleep, and so she jumped out of bed, yelling her name, running down the hallway to catch up with her. As my mom approached the kitchen, however, her aunt wasn't there, just the radio playing and her mother standing washing dishes. She asked, "Mom, where did Auntie go? I just saw her come down here." Her mother replied, "Honey, you must have been having a dream. Auntie lives 5 hours away. She's at home with your uncle who's taking care of her." The phone rang not 5 minutes later, and it was her uncle calling to let them know that Auntie had died peacefully in her sleep that very afternoon. I used to walk home from work every night at around 11 p.m. The walk was not long, but there was one part of that walk that always made me hurry, and that was when passing through a narrow alleyway with overhanging tree limbs on both sides. My imagination would run riot, and in the darkness those tree limbs took on shapes or hid monsters. I always ran down that alley. On one particular night, the feeling of fear on approaching that alley was higher than usual. It was very windy, and that wind made the limbs of the trees sway as well as being very loud. I took a deep breath and began to run the 30 meters or so through the alley. No sooner had I entered the alley than I felt something touch my hand. I have no idea what went on that night, but I will swear that a ghost hand held mine and pulled me through that alley at a great speed. Maybe it was my imagination, but that hand left a mark, as in pulling me by the hand. The grip was quite tight. The marks were still visible when I got home and told my parents. From that time on, I took a longer route home and avoided the alley altogether. Here I lay, all snuggled up in bed, warm and satisfied under the soft silk covers, watching some stupid documentary on TV I'd never heard of. I turned the channel, but the gallon tub of cookie dough ice cream wouldn't let me use my hands for anything other than shoveling the frozen treat into my mouth. Nights like these are rare. It isn't often that everyone's out of the house but me, so I make sure to savor them. In fact, I wasn't expecting anyone back till the morning. That's what made the sound of the door opening downstairs so alarming. Panic hits me like a steam train. I silently leap out from under the covers, spilling the ice cream all over the pristine white carpet on the floor, and creak open the wardrobe next to the bed. I hear footsteps, heavy and indiscreet, like they want me to know they're here. I pant and pick up the spoon I had just been using to enjoy a relaxing night. The footsteps get louder. I force myself into the minuscule space remaining in the wardrobe and close the door, just as the stranger opens the bedroom door, not sparing any seconds for silence. I peer through the gap. His face looks familiar, but I can't place my finger on where I know him from. He spots the spilled ice cream and darts his head across the wide expanse of the bedroom. "Hello?" he calls. Not sounding vicious, but I've made that mistake before. Never, under any circumstances, assume friendliness from a voice. He looks under the bed. Oh, crap. He's looking for someone. I hold back a whimper and start bending the bowl of the spoon back and forth, hoping to snap it off and create some way of defending myself. It snaps, but it creates a metallic click. The man turns his head around and makes his way to the wardrobe. I'm shaking now. Please don't open it. Please don't open it. Please don't open it! The door swings open and he sees me. We scream simultaneously in fear and surprise. Without hesitation, I leap onto the man and start digging into whatever stretch of flesh I can with the sharp edge of the spoon handle. He screeches in clear pain, but I won't stop. I hammer the handle deep into his chest and neck over and over till he becomes motionless. I've killed him. I cry in disgust and sprint downstairs and away from the house. I charge down the road until I feel like I'm far enough away. I sit down for a moment and exhale heavily before regaining my composure. Pulling out my phone, I open Twitter and search #party. Hopefully, this time I'll find a household that isn't lying when they say they'll be out all night.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please share it with someone you know who loves the paranormal or strange stories, true crime, monsters, or unsolved mysteries like you do. And please leave a rating and review of the show in the podcast app you listen from. You can email me anytime with your questions or comments at darren@weirddarkness.com. Darren is D-A-R-R-E-N. WeirdDarkness.com is also where you can find all of my social media, listen to audiobooks I've narrated, shop the Weird Darkness store, sign up for monthly contests, find other podcasts that I host, and find the Hope in the Darkness page if you or someone you know is struggling with depression or dark thoughts. Also on the website, if you have a true paranormal or creepy tale to tell, you can click on Tell Your Story. You can find all of that and more at WeirdDarkness.com. All stories in Weird Darkness are purported to be true unless stated otherwise, and you can find source links or links to the authors in the show notes. Weird Darkness is a production and trademark of Marlar House Productions. And now that we're coming out of the dark, I'll leave you with a little light. Proverbs 15, verse 33, "The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor." And a final thought, whenever you see a successful business, someone once made a courageous decision. Peter F. Drucker. I'm Darren Marlar. Thanks for joining me in the Weird Darkness.